I want to conclude this series by talking about several dimensions and elements of the sphere. The first one is that a sphere has infinite dimensions because it can be refracted with an infinite number of dots and an infinite number of lines in the creation of the sphere. And what this means is one can invent an idea and thus create a distinction by using language. And immediately you have another refraction point of all the possible refraction points available. So if we look at truth, and if we look at the interaction between the small self, that is us, and the large self, that is the reality that we're ecologically a part of, we know that set theory, mathematical set theory, says you cannot fully understand something until you're outside the set. We're not outside the set of being human, and we're certainly not outside the set of being bigger than the allness of all that is. But if we use a couple of guidelines in the creation of distinction and the integration of distinction to create truer versions of truth, to head in the right direction, one of the things that we can look at is convergent points. Where does geometry, mathematics, and dreams overlap? Kind of lead to a Venn diagram where this is consistent with mathematics, it's consistent with geometry, it's consistent with psychology. Okay, it's consistent with dreams, it's consistent with psychology, it's consistent with mathematics. If you can find connection points and translation algorithms that lead to convergence, you're heading in the right direction when it comes to creating an integrated or recreating, because it exists, and then what we're trying to do is recapture reality within the limited framework of the human ego, using heuristic models of reality that aren't true but are heading towards truth. They're not perfect, they're not beautiful, but they're heading towards beauty and perfection. We want to look at integration. Now here's one of the interesting things with the spherical model of reality. One of the things that you would anticipate with the spherical model of reality is that if you have a true direction, that you travel around, you travel around, you travel around, you travel around, and you'll end up in the same place. So that's one of the, within the paradigm of a spherical heuristic model of reality, one of the ways to get a sense of whether you're heading in the right direction is, do you end up in the same place? And if you looked deeply at a number of extremes, because an extreme is a direction. Now let's follow selfishness around the planet. So you typically have a dualistic paradigm overlaid onto selfishness and selflessness, right? So, and having decided that they are opposites, selfishness and selflessness, you then tell people to be selfless, to don't be selfish, right? And elevate the one above the other. This is part of chauvinistic thinking. You break the whole into half, and then you elevate one half over the other. So selfishness is bad. And yet I would argue that selfishness is not present enough. That if you truly want to be selfish, one of the first things that you do is fulfill your human needs. And your human needs break down to, first of all, you need to survive. To be selfish, you need to feel secure. to be selfish. You need to develop love and belonging to be selfish. You need to develop self-esteem, to like yourself and earn that like by becoming someone more in order to be selfish. Because to be selfish is to do what is good for the self. Well, is it good for you to have self-esteem? It is. Is it good for you to be secure? Is it good to have lots of people who will protect you and support you with love and belonging? No, it's good. It's good for the self to develop one's gifts, the fifth hierarchy of human needs. It's good for the self to bring those gifts out to the world and be honored and recognized and create abundance. It's good for the self to reach beyond the limited sense of self to the larger transcendent version of self. If you can imagine a cell within the body, first making itself completely healthy, then realizing all of its potential as a cell within the body, and then reaching out to become part of the larger physical body of which the cell is a part, and participating in a co-creative dynamic in which the whole self survives more, grows more, etc., which of course includes the greater security of the cell, because the cell is ultimately vulnerable if the larger self is a moron and drives off a cliff with a car. The small cell dies when the larger self dies. And so in that sense, to reach towards the larger sense of self, understanding that in the fractal patterns of reality, you have an endless microcosm, macrocosm, fractal pattern. That the self is a part of a larger self, that's part of a larger self, that's part of a larger self, that's part of a larger self, infinitely. And that the self is the larger self of a smaller self, of a smaller self, of a smaller self, infinitely. That to reach towards the larger self while honoring the smaller selves is a mathematical recipe for sustainable well-being and actualization. And so this is selfish. To become all that we can be, to experience all the well-being we can create, is selfish. It is good for the self, for the sustainability of the self, the enjoyment of the self. Similarly, to reach towards consciously creating fun, to reach towards consciously creating success is good for the self. It's wonderful for the self. And in this sense of pursuing selfishness, now that we've got our self-actualized, it's good for the self. But what if our family, what if the people around us are in terror, in trauma, in mediocrity? Are they going to be good lovers for us? Are they going to be good conversationalists for us? You ever try and talk with a traumatized person? It's so boring. They get lost in their panic and anxiety. It's so boring. So if you're really selfish, you don't want people who are traumatized around you. Well, do you want to be able to be confined to a very tiny place where I can only hang out with 4 people because they're the only untraumatized people in my circle? No. If you want freedom of movement, for me, you've got to create successful, integrated, selfish people around you who are selfish enough to actually care for themselves. Because is it selfish to develop reason? Or do you want to be a complete moron? Which is more selfish, to be a moron or to have reason? Well, to have reason is partly to be reasonable. Meaning you cannot have reason if you are unreasonable. If you are unable to have reason, you are unreasonable. So it is profoundly self-loathing to be unreasonable, and it is selfish to be reasonable, because reason increases personal well-being when applied intelligently. So if you're really selfish, would you apply reason intelligently to boost your well-being? Well, the mathematics are clear. For you to have the greatest odds of success, you've got to help other people participate in their success around you. It's easier to be successful around successful people. It's easier to create well-being with truly selfish people. Because this misery and addiction and stuff is not selfish, it's self-loathing. Sabotaging, being unreasonable, failing to apply reason, destroying one's own life is not selfish. It's self-hatred. Now, if you really want to be selfish, you become your best person. You create your best reality. You support people creating their best selves and their best reality. And you ripple out so that you can travel around the world and be surrounded by highly competent, highly successful, highly self-loving, highly self-actualized, highly integrated, synergistic human beings who can increase the probability field of well-being for you exponentially. Meaning when people are truly selfish and they understand what selfish means, because selfishness includes being reasonable, including reason and response to reason, which avoids a tremendous amount of unnecessary suffering. Unnecessary suffering is not selfish. It's stupidity. Stupidity is not selfish. Blindness is not selfish. So we're not dealing with a problem with selfishness. We're dealing with a problem that nobody knows how to be selfish enough to create and participate in creating a sustainable problem or a sustainable planet, sustainable culture, and a sustainable community. We are not selfish enough. We're not even selfish enough to know what selfishness is for the most part. That's not selfish. To not even bother enough about ourselves to know what real selfishness is? It's pathetic. It's not selfish, it's pathetic. It's self-negation. So the true honoring of the self gradually leads to behavior, starting within with self-love and self-actualization and moving outwards, to a complete transformation of the community, the planet, the family of which one is a part. Try to make millions when everyone's poor. It's much harder than trying to make millions when everyone's a billionaire. If you want to make millions and you're surrounded by a billion billionaires, it's pretty easy. But if you want to make millions and you're surrounded with people that are in debt and don't have any money, it's hard. Everyone's suspicious, etc. So you want a wealthy, healthy, self-loving, intelligent, competent group of people who are selfish enough to know what selfish means and then realize it. Now, what is the difference between being 100% selfish and 100% selfless? Because if we start at the other side of the extreme, because we've pretty much followed selfishness to the point where every single person on the planet is healthy. You see, if one person on the planet has cholera or has coronavirus, everyone else is vulnerable, including you. So you want a planet where not one person has a disease, mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, or otherwise. Because that's a planet that's a hell of a lot of fun to live in, which is selfish. But what's the difference between seeking to help others create a magnificent version of reality. And, because if you help one person, like I'm going to help you, could be whoever it is, I'm going to totally devote myself to helping you. Well, you're the closest person in their life if you're that devoted. So are you going to help them by being incompetent? By not having your own security covered? I'm going to help you, but I don't have money to pay my rent? No, that's not selfless. It's incredibly narcissistic. I'm going to place my burdens on you and call it helpful. So if I want to be truly selfless, first of all, I've got to survive. I can't help you if I'm dead. I've got to feel secure in my survival. You're going to be nervous for me if you see I'm always on the edge. I'm going to create love and belonging. This will create more independence and also liberation from the codependency of the relationship. I'm going to develop self-esteem, become someone I aspire to be. That's a nice gift to you. I'm going to develop my gifts and bring them abundantly into the world and touch others. Well, that's nice for you that you've got a talented person helping them. And I'm going to transcend and become part of a bigger vision of creating a better reality for everyone, becoming part of something bigger than self. Well, that's nice for you too, isn't it? So the path of being 100% selfless is to create and participate in creating a highly functional, valuable world, beginning with oneself, that is sustainable and loving and healthy in all dimensions. That's the best, most selfless thing that I could possibly do, and it begins by taking care of the real estate that I most influence, myself, this little body, this mind. And similarly, to be 100% selfish, you don't start with loving other people. You start by loving yourself, if you're selfish. But they end up in exactly the same thing, and that's the point. This is how you know you're dealing with an accurate model of reality within a spherical paradigm. You follow selfishness all the way around, all the way around, all the way around, all the way around, all the way around. It's about half the way through. You can't tell the difference between being 100% selfless and 100% selfish, because they're one and the same. The same is true with mathematics. If you follow an equation fully around, you will lead to a truer, more beautiful, and good version of reality. And I'll give you an example of this because the dysfunctions in our world come from the intersection. See, because reality is spherical, but cultures are not spherical. They're crude renditions of a part of the sphere. And one of the most damaging aspects of cultures are their taboos, because taboos are things that cannot be looked at, talked about, or understood. They're just blocked. That's what makes them a taboo as opposed to a basis of intelligent conversation. So whenever you have a taboo, like intersecting the circle, it stops us from perceiving the circular nature of polarity. You see, selfishness and selflessness in their true forms are one and the same. They're just at different points on the same process. Loving someone else and loving oneself, similarly, they're the same circle at different points on the same process. Now, when we look at something like an economy, and we look at the math of the economy, we know there's something wrong when it appears profitably to burn down the lungs of the earth to raise hamburgers for a couple of years before the soil gives out. This is what happened to millions of acres in the Amazon jungle, was that the rainforest was viewed as unprofitable. And when you do something that is profoundly self-hating for the present and future generations, you realize that you've missed part of the equation. And one of the interesting things that's missed in the equation is that if we look at, for example, the discovery of Carrere, which led to anesthetics, an increase in surgery, and a variety of medical innovations. Every single party in the development of Western medicine that utilized Carrere made money, lots of it, except the native tribes who developed the technology. Now, the native tribes, using plant-spirit dialogue, including ayahuasca, learned how to develop the technology so that the Western companies could copy and synthesize anesthetics and create billions upon billions of dollars of industry out of the direct fruits of the native tribes in the Amazon jungle. Now, what you see when you have taboos, because we're part of the taboo in materialistic Western science, is that there cannot be anything that the human eye cannot perceive. So radical materialism has faith that nothing else exists beyond the material world. And they have to have faith in that because there's no evidence to support that. It is a leap of faith. Radical materialism relies upon faith with the same dogmatic fervor as extremists of all religions. The extreme scientists have faith that there is no God, that there is no purpose, that there is no meaning, that there's no consciousness and all that. And the extreme religious have faith that there is. And both, to a certain extent, are out to get one another, though it's kind of interesting that scientists haven't just thrown in the bag, having decided that there's no meaning, no consciousness, no purpose to any of it, and that it's all material. Why not just die? Because there's no purpose to your life if you subscribe to that belief. But very interestingly, the radical atheists and materialists do not behave consistent with their dogma. They have faith, they will tell you, that there is no meaning and no consciousness and no purpose to life. But somehow they've got to write a book to convince you of that fact, despite the fact that their book, based on their own arguments, has no purpose, is meaningless, is random, and that the readers reading the book and their consciousness doesn't exist either. So if scientists truly believed that everything they did was meaningless, worthless, random, and didn't exist, they wouldn't bother doing it. They wouldn't be pro-science, because science is meaningless, has no purpose, has no consciousness, and the fucked up moron creating the scientific theses is as fucked up and delusional as the radical Christian they're thesising against. You don't fight something when there's no meaning. It makes no sense. So you have a little bit more schizophrenia in the faith-based science of materialism. But nonetheless, within the faith-based science of materialism, nothing visionary can exist. So the fact that the shamanic tribes have given Western medicine most of its new technology over the last 100 years is viewed as valueless because the source cannot be acknowledged within the reductionist paradigm of materialism. So you have the figure is discounted. So the equation is not real. As a result of that figure being discounted, the Indians, the native tribes, have not been paid. They've not received any money. And in a capitalist framework, that also means they're poor, which means they're not important, which is a capitalist dogma, which doesn't hold up because capitalism suggests the mathematical equation that the money that people make is more valuable than the people who make it, which is an unsustainable, irrational equation put forth by irrational, self-hating capitalists who don't grasp the idea that if a human being invented the idea of money, if other human beings agreed to go along with that idea of money, if other human beings agreed to do the activities that made the money, and if other human beings participated in the counting and transferring and banking of the money, that it is the human beings that matter, not the fucking bits of paper that are produced as a symbolic representation of that value. You therefore take better care of human beings, the goose that lays the golden eggs, than you do of bits of paper. Which is where you have the idea not that money is the root of all evil, but that the love of money, the love of the symbol of value, elevated over the underlying asset. The problem with the defunct, mortgage security crisis. When derivatives are valued more than the underlying real estate that they are derived from, you run into financial problems. When money is valued more than the people who make it, you run into cultural problems and ultimately financial collapse, because money doesn't care about money. So if you kill off the people or destroy the economy such that people don't have money to spend, all the money in the world doesn't do you any good. What grows an economy is a healthy, educated, talented group of people. Period. A healthy, educated, talented group of people is guaranteed to generate large amounts of value for themselves and those around them. If that value is symbolically recognized as money, it doesn't matter. Or if it's traded in terms of direct goods, it doesn't matter. What matters is the creation of value and how much net value is created per capita. People who don't grasp that are the people who will destroy individual lives to get a few bucks because they value money more than the people who make the money. And they don't understand the downward spiral they are a part of that ultimately ends in them losing all their money. Because if you're a trillionaire in a world that you have bankrupted, in which no one can afford your products, you are the biggest loser around. Because you've got nothing, you've devalued the symbol of value to nothing, because people can't buy the products, and you've destroyed and undercut their growth and education to a point where they can't provide any value to you. And you look out at a world of mediocrity that will lead to viral diseases, and you're going to be one of the first people to get sick with your high sugar, high fat luxury diet that doesn't build your immune system. So it's not actually intelligent to do this. And the irrational equations, see, a circular equation, you've got to follow it all the way around the sphere. And then the end is the beginning. And the beginning is the end. That's how you know you're on the right track. And particularly if you are on the right track of multiple circular equations that are ending up and converging in this Venn diagram that they all agree with one another, it's a very, very strong case that you're moving in the right direction, knowing that there is no end, there is no ultimate truth, there's just a direction to move in. What a taboo does is it takes part of the mathematical equation that's being written vertically and horizontally on the tapestry of reality and is being invented by the conscious mind who creates the distinctions upon which the equation occurs. Mathematics is an invention of human consciousness which, when overlaid on reality, creates a circular equation that goes all the way around reality. You can follow the mathematical formula between this finger and every single star in the universe if you have the mathematical ability to do so. You just keep following this finger and see how it relates to this and this and this and this and this and this, and it will lead you throughout the known universe. As one equation affects the other equation, affects the other equation, and you will eventually come back to the finger. After circling the universe and looking at every known thing, you will have infinite connections between this finger and all that is. That's mathematics. Now, we invented it, and it leads us back to all that we are. Geometry, another thing. If you follow the logic of geometry, it will lead you to the sphere and the understanding and the mathematical relationship with everything. If you follow the mathematics of psychology, the equations of psychology fully, and step through the taboos of the cult, you will first of all come to understand your entire environment, because the psyche is a microcosm of the environment. If you fully understand yourself, you will understand everything else. If you understand everything else, you will fully understand the self. That's the nature of fractal patterns in a microcosm and a macrocosm. Psychology is a refraction of the inner world that mirrors the outer world, of the smaller self that mirrors the larger self. If you understand biology fully, it will lead you to geometry and mathematics. If you understand mathematics and geometry fully, it will lead you to biology. If you understand language fully, it will lead you to mathematics. If you understand mathematics fully, it will lead you to language. Every dimension leads and infers the other dimensions that are on the possibility, probability, and actuality field. And there are many, many, many dimensions of reality and human consciousness that we have not created yet. We haven't added them as a linguistic distinction that would allow us to start on the circular journey of all that is, following that particular equation. But if the equation is sound, whatever invention, whatever dimension we exist, will lead us from one extreme to the other extreme, from the one extreme to the other extreme, even to the sense that how can you have black without white? Because black exists in the tension between white, and white exists in the tension of black. And if you spread them out on a color wheel, it takes you around the circle from one to the other, lightening this, adding this, fusing this, adding this, all the way back to the other. And that gives you the full spectrum of the possibility field of color. Interrelatedness is a mathematical equation that connects to mathematics, geometry, biology, language, culture, etc. What I'm basically saying is that if you're on the right track and you apply the scientific method of following one thing to another thing to another thing, if you'll take the goal of being 100% selfish, 100% good, 100% true, 100% going up, like I'm just going to go this way as far as I can possibly go. You'll go all the way around, you'll come up the other direction. Every extreme leads directly to its opposite. And if you're not willing to embrace that reality, because you have an either-or paradigm rather than a both-and paradigm, once you start becoming selfish in order to be selfless, you will have to deny and fight and hide this, because you can't embrace the opposite that is tied in with your stated chauvinistic value, the chauvinistic value that says that we're going to cut the world in half, and then half of the world is going to be elevated and the other half is going to be sublimated. We're going to elevate half of the world and we're going to damn and condemn half of the world. So as I go along the circle, everything that we elevate has to be divorced from what we condemn. For example, we say, oh, look, America is a free country. It's so peaceful. Some have that perspective. It's so peaceful. Well, how did it get that way? It had a civil war. It had a war of independence. So if the peace is dependent on war, and the war is dependent on peace, and if you follow those two extremes, you should be able to form a connection between the two. That without the abundance that comes from peace, because you don't get abundance in war. If people were constantly in war without peace in between, they couldn't save up enough energy and wealth to go back to war and waste all their money and kill all their people. So one is dependent on the other. Particularly in a lot of our, our level of consciousness. One is dependent on the other. Pick a refraction point and follow it throughout its in-depth circular narrative, and notice where it intersects with other dimensions and converges, and you get a bigger sense of reality. The biggest price of cult taboos is that they insist on blindness of the full equation that passes through the terrain of the taboo. And as a result, we get a total that doesn't match the underlying equations that produced it, which creates a certain amount of insanity. And in an effort to hide that insanity, we go down a tailspin of disintegration, lies, and mediocrity, simply because every family, every ego, every cult has certain truths and information that they'd rather not confront and deal with. So when their equation leads them through that terrain in the sphere, they go to great lengths to go insane to create the same outcome without the equations that pass through the taboo terrain of the territory.